Welcome to the Backyard Professor Chess videos. I had a question on the knights that was put on one of my videos that I want to address in this video. What do we do with them? How do we work the knights in our chess game? So many people really do favor the queen, and justifiably so in many respects, because she is the most powerful piece. But when it comes to the knights and the bishops, we don't know what to do exactly. I have many Grandmaster games that I've been playing through this last couple of weeks that I'm going to demonstrate, use as an illustration, on what to do if your opponent has knights and how to make your knights stronger than your opponent's. And I've got a classic game that Jeremy Silman shows in his Amateur's Mind that I want to show you first on how to deal with knights, and then I'll discuss some of the general strategies, rules, and laws of knighthood in chess. Now here is a classic game that was played by Wilhelm Steinitz and Rosenthal in Vienna of 1873. Now that was a long time ago. In this game, Steinitz demonstrated the classic way to defeat an opponent's knight. Steinitz was black, Rosenthal was white. The first thing Steinitz does is he presses his c-pawn, and he's attacking this knight. Now that knight has a beautiful outpost right here because of the pawn structure supporting that square. That's what you want to do when you get a knight, is you want to give it a pawn outpost so that it can stay there, because the queen's not going to take that knight that way. So he moved, Rosenthal moved his knight over here to f3. Steinitz continued with b6. Now this was very important second pawn move, because the idea is to deprive that knight of that square for the rest of the game. And he wants this pawn to have support from that pawn. So he builds his pawn chain so that Rosenthal can never use the d4 square again for his knight. That was a very important move for him. So he comes at him with the knight at e5. And you can see his range of influence here coming in around the king's area. So that's another very good outpost because of the pawn. The knight is using the pawn as a support structure for an outpost. When we have an opponent who has a knight like this, and when they insist on using a knight, we don't have to let them stay on good outpost squares. You can defeat their knights. And this is a very important part of your battle in chess. You have to know what to do with the knights, the bishops, just in case queens get exchanged. He brought his queen back up here to e6. So Rosenthal brought his queen up to f3. Then Steinitz took his bishop to a6, getting a very beautiful long diagonal right down here to the rook. So now, because he has chased the knight around a little bit, Steinitz can now begin his buildup of his forces. He defends his a8 rook here by connecting the rooks, and he attacks the rook at the same time. So that's a very good move. Well, Rosenthal doesn't have to leave his rook there, so he puts it on e1, which will give him the open file. You notice Steinitz's queen is on the same file as the rook. Always a good idea to do if you have the rooks and you want to scare off your opponent's queen. Later on in the game, Steinitz again pushes a pawn to chase the knight away. You don't have to let him have a really powerful knight. There's nothing says you have to do that. So he brings his knight over here to the g4 square. Steinitz says, that's okay. I'm going to press my pawn to the h5. Notice how he is literally driving this knight away. This is a very important concept. This is a beautiful game illustrating just how to do that. Now look at this. Knight goes to f2. And at that point, that knight is doing nothing. But it's a permanent situation for that knight. That knight won't get back into the game at all. Steinitz brings his queen up to f7. Rosenthal makes a bloober here with the f5. This is going to be a weak pawn at that point. Steinitz pushes his pawn to g5. Rosenthal brings his rook over to d1, grabbing the open file. Steinitz brings his bishop back over to the b7, grabbing that diagonal and scaring the queen away. There's nothing here to compare with the strength of that bishop. That black bishop is absolutely king of that board. The knight doesn't compare to it. The rook doesn't compare to it, because not only does Rosenthal have rooks, but Steinitz has rooks, and they will fight over those open files. But this bishop here is king of the game at this point. This bishop is vastly stronger and more superior than this sickly knight right here, who does nothing, because that knight has nowhere to go. He has no influence in the game. This is the basic gist, the basic idea of how to wipe out an opponent's knights. Take away the squares that they can safely land on. Now I want to illustrate a game played by Mikhail Tal, the former world champion in 1960 and 1961, and a man named Ciric, C-I-R-I-C. They both established knights as outposts, but how Tal works this situation is really beautiful to watch. Tal is white. He opens with the king pawn. Ciric is going with the Sicilian defense. Tal pushes his knight. Opens with their knights. Immediately brings his bishop up to pin the knight eventually. Ciric brings out his queen immediately. And this establishes a good queenside thrust if he can get his game going. Tal develops his knight in a general sort of way. It is better to develop your knights sooner than your bishops if you can. Brings his pawn to e6. Tal castles. It's always a good idea to castle early. Get your king tucked away in safety if you can. Watch what Ciric does. He immediately establishes his knight in the center of the board with his great influence, and that pawn is giving him his outpost. Now, Tal does not let his opponent keep that knight. There's no way you have to let your opponent keep that knight. So he's going to bring his bishop back into the game instead of leaving it there, but the queen chases. Over here to a5. Tal presses the pawn here. Ciric brings his pawn up here, challenging the bishop. And Tal brings his pawn up here, challenging the queen. Tal was a very strong chess player. Instead of always moving his bishop around, he decides he's going to do a counterattack. Very interesting. Drops his queen back to b6. Tal takes the pawn. Still threatening the queen. This gives Ciric a chance to bring out a bishop. However, notice, in this subtle exchange, or not so subtle exchange, the knight has now lost his outpost pawn that supports him. It's best to support your knights or bishops or rooks with pawn outposts, not piece outposts, because the pieces can be chased away, and then that leaves your piece hanging with no support or power. Tal grabs the open file, absolutely, straight up from the queen. Whenever you have open files, try to get them, use them. Cyric establishes his pawn structure stronger. This knight has to go. It no longer has a support point with a pawn, so Tal exchanges the knights. This is good chess. You don't have to let your opponent leave a knight on an outpost in the center of the board dominating the game. At this point, the development is fairly well even. Of course, Cyric responds by exchanging the knight. So now we're beginning to get an interesting imbalance going on here. Tal brings his knight to e2. You notice he doesn't leave it inactive. He recognizes, I'm going to establish my knight and not let Cyric establish his. Well, Cyric says nothing doing. I'm going to bring my knight out into the game also, attacking this e4 pawn. It's a very important pawn at this point. It's so important that Tal brings up the d3, the pawn to d3 to support that e4 pawn. So now you can see there's a real fight brewing. We have all kinds of interesting angles, diagonals. Cyric drops his bishop back, and Tal brings up his queen-bishop pawn to c4. Now this pawn structure, Tal is trying to establish the center here. He's saying, I'm going to dominate this game, not you. Cyric does a simple one-move check, which essentially does nothing for his game. Tal simply takes it with the king. The queen comes up and nabs the diagonal, again putting the king in check. Instead of moving the king back out of check, Tal sees this opportunity to really seize the initiative in this game. He's going to take control of this game. Can you see what his move's going to be? He brings his bishop up and threatens the queen. Covers the check and threatens the queen. Instead of just simply moving in a passive defensive mode, Tal stops the check with a very powerful offensive move. Now Cyric does something interesting. He pushes his pawn to block the bishop. Tal sees an opportunity to get rid of Cyric's last knight and keep his own knight. Because essentially, there's central pawns here. So this game is technically what they call a closed game. The center isn't wide open. It's got pawns in it. This is an ideal situation for knights because they're short-term, short-range pieces and they need pawns to support them. Watch how Tal turns this situation into his one game. This is beautiful how he does it. He loses his bishop. It's okay. He's willing to exchange. At this point, he gets rid of the last knight that Cyric had. Cyric, of course, responds by taking the bishop with the pawn, the only move he can do. He's got doubled pawns now. But now look at this board situation. The center is, for all intents and purposes, completely closed with this pawn structure. Cyric has no knights. His bishop over here on c8 is doing absolutely nothing. Now Tal can go to work. Tal has one of the open files. Tal immediately launches his knight into the issue. Can you see what square that knight's going to? You absolutely can. Cyric brings his bishop, grabbing the long diagonal, threatening the going through the pawn. Tal brings his queen up for good support, heading right to these doubled pawns. Cyric, of course, says, no, I can't let you do that. I've got to have this open file. I've got to keep somewhat of a control of the game. And then Tal lets out the monster. Once he takes that double pawn, because that's the weak pawn, there's no pawns here to support that pawn, so that's a free pawn for Tal. Cyric says, no, I'm going to notice the rook outpost. The rook has great power here because those two pawns are supporting him. You can use an outpost for your rooks, your bishops, your knights, etc. So Tal now has to back down, and he uses this pawn for the support of his queen. Cyric moves his king up. Tal presses his pawn. Cyric brings his rooks over and doubles it on the file heading toward the king, so this is getting to be a serious situation. Cyric is putting great pressure right now on Tal's king side. His king isn't really well covered, although he can duck back under cover if he needs to. But this is getting to be a tough situation for Tal. This is by no means easy to discover what to do. So Tal takes advantage of his open file and takes a bishop, because the diagonal coming in is so strong with that open file that he loses the exchange. He sacrifices his rook for Cyric's bishop. And then at this point, he has to grab the open file from Cyric, and Cyric, of course, has to concede the open file. So you can see they're playing open files with their rooks, which is exactly what you have to do with rooks. Tal grabs him another pawn, puts the king in check. The rook, of course, the strong way, is to simply block the check with the rook. And what do you think Tal does at this point? Does he move his queen again? No, he does not. He does something absolutely fantastic. He brings his knight to this most powerful outpost, right in the center of the board on the d5 square. From here, this knight radiates pure power, and he puts the king in check. Of course, Cyric has to move his king out of check. Tal went on to win the game, and now he can move his queen out of danger, still putting pressure against the king, and now he has another very powerful piece that cannot be chased away. Now, this is the interesting thing about this particular outpost that Tal put together. This knight can't be chased away by a pawn. There are no pawns here of black to go either here or here to chase the knight away. That knight has a permanent home right there, and he is powerfully supported in the middle. And Cyric has one open file, and his rooks, his rook and queen are no longer connected. Tal went on to win this game because of his strategy, and this knight played a very influential part of that game. It's a very instructive way to see how to use your knights.